Hello, everyone. I would like to welcome all our guests and our audience to this event hosted by Pontificia Universidad Javeriana's Law School. Today, as our guest, we have Samuel Moyn. He is Professor of Jurisprudence and History at Yale University. He received a doctorate from the University of California, Berkeley in 2000 and a law degree from Harvard University in 2001. He came to Yale from Harvard University, and before that, he spent 13 years at Columbia University. His areas of interest include international law, human rights, and the law of war and legal thought in both historical and current perspective. He has written several books in the fields of history and human rights history, including The Last Utopia, Human Rights, published in 2010. And he has also edited or co-edited a few other books. Over the years, he has written in venues such as the Boston Review, the Chronicle of Higher Education, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal. His most recent book is Humane, How the United States Abandoned Peace and Reinvented War. And this is the book that we will be commenting today. For the purpose of this, we have Professor Tania Luna from Universidad Javeriana and Professor Roberto Vidal, also professor from Universidad Javeriana and justice at the Special Peace Jurisdiction. As moderators, we will have Santiago García, professor at Javeriana, and Nicolás Esguerra, former professor at Javeriana. Both Santiago and Nicolás are LL.M students at Yale University at the moment and are alumni from our law school. So we are very grateful that they provided this contact with Professor Moyn. Now I will leave you with our Dean, Professor Carolina Olarte Bácares.
Thank you very much, Carolina. And good afternoon to everybody. It is a pleasure to welcome you today to this interesting seminar and to welcome again Professor Samuel Moyn to our School of Law at Javeriana University to discuss this time about his new book, Humane, How the United States Abandoned Peace and Reinvented War. Welcome, Professor Moyn, to our virtual campus. I also welcome our Professor Santiago García Jaramillo and Nicolás Esguerra, who will be with us today moderating the discussion. After Professor Moyn's initial presentation, we will have a panel of comments led by Justice Roberto Vidal, professor at our university. Thank you very much, Roberto, for accepting enthusiastically this invitation to talk about a book that raises a subject that you introduced in the discussions in our law school. I also welcome our expert constitutionalist, Professor Tania Luna Blanco. For contexts such as Colombia's, where internal politics has always been closely linked to war, the question about its humanization or not, and in particular, the real meaning of the term prompts sensitive reflections, at least paradoxical and above all, very deep reflections, especially after reading Professor Moyn's book. As we are used to, the author of the book brings us a version that delights us and deeply questions us. Thank you very much again, Professor Moyn, for sharing your reflections with the School of Law at Javeriana University. And of course, thank you very much in advance to our commentators for their participation and reflections. I'm going to shift to Spanish to give a few words to our Spanish audience. Bienvenido, Profesor Moyn, a la Universidad Javeriana y a nuestra Facultad de Ciencias Jurídicas. Es un honor poder comentar el día de hoy su último libro y pues por supuesto le extiendo una bienvenida muy especial a nuestros profesores Nicolás y Santiago García, quienes además tuvieron la iniciativa de realizar este evento y nos pusieron en contacto nuevamente con el profesor Moyn y a nuestro querido profesor Roberto Vidal, que nos lleva muchos años generando preguntas muy importantes con respecto a esa relación entre política, derecho y por supuesto lo humano o lo no humano que está detrás. Pues bienvenido y muchas gracias por estar nuevamente con nosotros, a nuestra profesora Tania Luna, pues por supuesto muchas gracias por acompañarnos nuevamente en esta sesión de reflexión y bueno, les doy una cordial bienvenida y les auguro seguramente, como es usual, una gran discusión. Tienen la palabra nuestros moderadores, Santiago y Nicolás. Ah, no, perdón, me equivoqué. The floor is yours, Professor Moyn.
Okay, well, thank you so much. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity to present. So I'll just take the 20 minutes and try to summarize what I tried to do in the book. And then I'm really looking forward to the comments that are given and the questions that anyone may ask. So I hope you can see my screen. I'm just gonna just begin. So I began thinking about the topic of this book at the end of 2009, when the president of my country, whom you know, Barack Obama, flew to Oslo to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. And it was an amazing event a couple of months earlier in the fall, when we all woke up in the United States to the news that he had won it. He came down from the White House residence and said that luckily he had a new dog to help him kind of stay grounded, and his two daughters, who were very young at that time, also, helped him, keep his global superstardom in perspective. He actually added that he wasn't sure if he would ever deserve the Nobel Peace Prize, but certainly not yet, because he had barely been in office 8 months when he was given it. When he flew to Oslo in December to receive it, he gave an extraordinary speech. And in that speech, he surprised his listeners, because he said that even though he understood himself to be in the tradition of Martin Luther King Jr., who had also won the Nobel Peace Prize, Obama could not be a prophet of peace. He, unlike King, was a politician, and one who was in charge of the greatest superpower, including the greatest military superpower the world has ever known. And yet, he argued, he was a proponent of a moralized form of military force. And along the way, he mentioned the very first co-recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize in 1901, a Swiss gentleman named Henri Dunant, who mentioned that he agreed with the idea that Dunant had first conceived, that we should use international law to make war more humane. And Obama promised he would do so. Now, what we did not know at this time in late 2009, that far from bringing peace, Obama had spent that first year of his presidency reinventing the war on terror. And I want to suggest in my few minutes that the idea of making war humane was connected to this reinvention, which has still a lot, I think, to tell us. So I'll just run incredibly briefly through a few different kind of stages and how it could happen that the war on terror under Obama could be reinvented under what I'm going to call humane auspices. So I give a lot of attention in my new book to a great critic of that Swiss gentleman, Dunant, who heard about the first Geneva Convention, which Dunant imagined, but criticized it. That first convention had called for protecting wounded soldiers on battlefields. And the great Russian novelist Leo Tolstoy said it was a bad idea. Now, why did he do so? Well, first, I think he gave an argument that's not very persuasive. He said that leaving war brutal or cruel would make war less frequent, which is hard to believe. But in his later career, once he became a Christian, Tolstoy gave a different argument, which is one I think we should take seriously, more seriously. Namely, that making war humane while making the world a better place, less brutal a place, could come with certain risks. It could, in particular, create a new risk that war could be facilitated or legitimated, and therefore could happen more frequently, or once it starts, be continued more easily than otherwise. And if this is, persuasive, it would be a contingent risk, one that, exists to a greater or lesser extent, depending on the situation. And if it's a risk, it doesn't mean leaving war brutal. It just means controlling the risk so that humanity doesn't become bound up with the perpetuation of war. Now, that's not all Tolstoy said. He actually suggested there could be some causal pathways through which this risk that he identified of endless but more humane war could come to the world. And I'll just mention them briefly because I spend a lot of time investigating them, because I think they're very relevant now. The first pathway he imagined, I call the advocate's compromise. And he developed it through thinking about the attempt, which was very real for a long time, to make chattel slavery humane. And Tolstoy alleged that if there was a possibility of abolishing this evil of slavery, it might have been a mistake for reformers to compromise with slaveholders in order to make slavery more humane instead, which reformers did for 50 years. And so Tolstoy asked, what if it's a similar mistake for reformers like Henri Dunant to compromise with states, letting them fight wars, especially unjust wars, and then trying to make them a little bit less cruel? What if doing so entrenched the war, because it was credible to believe that making slavery had given it a new lease on life? So that was one causal pathway. The other I'm going to call the beneficiary's bad faith. And the focus is not on the advocate or reformer trying to make the world a better place, but the audience or beneficiary of violence. And here Tolstoy compared war to the slaughter of non-human animals and said, look, the trouble is that when we make practices that are violent more humane, people who watch the violence or benefit from it may think it's better and that they're better. So he compared humanizing war to the risk that would be involved when you have someone who eats meat but says it's not as bad an act now because the slaughtering process has been made more humane. And again, that could be a moral error, assuming eating meat is wrong, which was Tolstoy's assumption, not only as the greatest pacifist, but the greatest vegetarian of his time. But it could also have an entrenching effect. Like, what if people are willing to eat more meat or have bigger slaughterhouses that kill more animals, insofar as they take solace in the fact that the slaughterhouses are less cruel to the animals they kill? And so, generalizing, Tolstoy was a proponent of what we now in reform debates called abolition of not just slavery and slaughter, but war. and suggested that we should worry that harm reduction that involves the attempt to make suffering less grave could come at a risk of perpetuating a deeper or evil, for at least perpetuating it for longer. And I just want to insist that we don't have to be pacifists to take this view seriously. If there's a war that is unjust or is lasting, longer than is just, we can ask, is calling for it to be humane part of what's accounting for this, the endurance of this unjust war? I think that's especially relevant to Americans who I think have fought a lot of unjust wars in my lifetime, and sometimes worked very hard as reformers or accepted them more easily if they're the audience or beneficiary by being told by politicians like Obama that they're humane. Maybe this argument is relevant other places, since of course you've had a big debate in Colombia about the possible tension between peace and humanity in the form of accountability for war crimes that the law sometimes demands. I want to mention, although I only have 8 more minutes, that there were others who made other guesses, and we should remember them too. Dunant's successor in founding what's now the International Red Cross, named Gustave Moynier, said, well, no, what we're really doing is not postponing peace and entrenching war, but hastening peace. To the extent we make war more humane, we're kind of providing the conditions for more humanity that will ultimately forbid war itself. And in this view, humanizing war would be like a stepping stone or a rung on the ladder to peace. Now, this seems wrong to me, just as wrong as saying that brutality makes war less frequent, because we can think of many wars in our time that have been relatively more humane because of legal reform and the tolerance of audiences, but that don't stop. And I think America's war on terror is one. Amazingly, this same man who ran the Red Cross for decades, at a certain point says, I might be wrong. It might be possible to imagine that my legal reforms to make war more humane make it so harmless that we would have endless sanitary war. And he said, if that ever happened, I would have to change my activism and say that it's war itself, not what happens in it, that needs to be controlled first and foremost. Okay, well, just to make a long story short, I think we had to wait a long time for these worries that Tolstoy outlined to be serious. He was too early because the law wasn't humane in content. Maybe the 1864 Geneva Convention was, but for a really long time, the law of war was about permitting states to engage in extraordinary violence. And it was only later that constraints that I think had the chance of making war more humane were even there on paper, especially with regard to aerial bombardment. Second, and related to this, the laws of war permitted extraordinary violence against those who were not considered like legitimate opponents. And that's especially true in guerrilla warfare and more generally in colonial warfare, where the laws of war were not applied, especially on civilizational grounds or racial grounds, to lots of people. And finally, even when they did apply, they were just ignored so often. And World War I and World War II give us so much evidence for that proposition. So I think we're waiting a while. Tolstoy's anxieties can't be taken seriously until we actually have war made more humane. And I devote most of the book to kind of showing or proposing a hypothesis about when that happened. Basically in the 1970s, for a lot of reasons. The world was decolonized, and the victims of imperial violence for centuries had a say in the content of international law for the first time. And in the additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions demand a remarkable humanization of the standards of fighting, especially in targeting and in collateral damage standards, which are both, you know, really the first time aerial bombardment in particular is made to have any constraints whatsoever. And then there are the humanitarians. We'd had an anti-war movement in the United States before, actually, in the 19th and 20th centuries, but after the Vietnam War, it came close to disappearing. And instead we had humanitarian activism, which called for making war more humane, just as in embarrassment in response to the Vietnam War, the military agreed to subordinate the way it fights to the newly humane standards of war. This all kind of creates the conditions for at least taking seriously the possibilities that Tolstoy worried about. And I believe those materialized in the War on Terror. There were two wars on terror. The first initiated immediately on September 11, 2001, through two big interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq that took the form of big footprint wars with lots of troops, and often brutal form, including when George W. Bush's lawyers permitted torture and other war crimes. But once the War on Terror in its first form was delegitimated, it wasn't replaced by peace. It was replaced by a new form of the War on Terror. And it involved light footprint intervention through special forces, illustrated in the first map of the massive expansion of the places where special forces, small teams of men, fight and kill, or at least pass through. And of course, more generally, it was, I think, epitomized by no footprint warfare, drone strikes, which Bush started, but Obama escalated tenfold by building a drone infrastructure across the Middle East and Central Asia, as well as deep into the African continent. What I want to argue in closing is that this shift from the first to the second form of the War on Terror involved its rhetorical and real humanization, and that this may have mattered in letting the War on Terror in this new form drag on, indeed, through the present. We know that because Barack Obama said it when he gave his Nobel speech. As I mentioned, he said it's a source of strength that, unlike others, the United States fights humanely and remains a standard bearer in the conduct of war. And 4 years later, when he chose or was forced to come out and say something about the drone war that he had escalated, he said the same thing. He said, "You don't want me to fight brutal war." And even as there's no debate about whether the war continues, actually, he raised more doubts about endless war at that time than the peace activist who, if you remember this speech, heckled him in the midst of it. He still said the only ethical option we have is to fight endless and humane war. And so my suggestion is that we consider whether Tolstoy's objections apply to this new development. I want to insist that this is at the level of rhetoric, obviously, that Obama is speaking, but he also changed through new rules that he propounded that actually went beyond what the laws of war demand in the care for civilians that they require. Obama changed the conduct of the War on Terror. especially in targeting practices in the use of drones and special forces. So if this is at all plausible, that we should take Tolstoy's anxieties seriously and ask the question, did we fail to control a risk in doing the noble thing of making war more humane? Then I think we have to learn a couple of lessons. The first is never to care about the humanity of our wars until we've first resolved whether we should be fighting it in the first place. And perhaps we could have fewer wars that tend to make the world worse, not just focus too intently or exclusively on making war humane. And that's what I hope to see, because I can't think of an American war that's made the world a better place lately. And the fact that these wars have been fought more humanely, to me, isn't good enough as a citizen and a human being. And I hope that through this book, I convince some other people at a time of rising concern about the incidence of war to take this worry that Tolstoy, I think, brilliantly kind of outlined more seriously. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Well, thank you, Professor Moyn. And now Santiago, Nicolás, and Carolina.
I think it's Santiago and Nicolás' turn to moderate the debate.
Yeah, so I think
Discussion. Okay.
yeah, we now give the floor to Roberto and Tania. So it's like, I think if Tania goes first or Roberto, as you prefer.
No, Tania, please.
Okay, thank you. Well, thanks for the presentation. I'd like first to thank the organizers of this meeting for inviting me here today. And well, my colleagues, Roberto Vidal, Santiago García, Nicolás Esguerra, and of course, Professor Samuel Moyn, for the writer of this extremely interesting book, Humane, How the United States Abandoned Peace and Reinvented War. I want especially thanks Carolina Vélez for the whole organization. It is an honor to be here, Professor Moyn, and have the opportunity to comment on your book. Furthermore, that we can discuss some ideas regarding history, war, and peace in our contemporary world. I like to divide this commentary into three sections. First, I want to talk about how the book's narrative helps to historize a silent historical process, which is usually shown to as a linear, cumulative, and civilizing. After all, very few good questions that international humanitarian law is a tool on the side of peace. Secondly, I wish to focus on the ethical question surrounding the humanization of the war, a question that seems to be the elephant in the room within international humanitarian law, but which we have evaded over time by settling for convention and international norms that we rarely question morally. And finally, I would like to highlight some reasons why I believe that the book contributes to confront our contemporary world and our moral possibilities from the role we can play in this story, whether as activists, academics, students, professionals, but above all as human beings. To begin with my first point, I want to emphasize that the book contributes to historize a silent historical process. Its page give an account of a historical process that explains why there is a naturalization around the idea of the humanization of war. There are many stories within the history that the book tells, with many protagonists, not only Tolstoy, but also Dunant, Moynier, Bertha von Suttner, also, I love this character and her story. Red Cross, Lyndon Johnson, Human Rights Watch, Bush, Obama, Trump, and of course, many ideas fighting in the times trying to conquer moral walls, defending humanitarian law visions as an alternative and an imaginary space that actors, individuals or institutionals identify as power and sell as an unavoidable historical consequence, a legacy of our rationality and our civilized law. From this perspective, there is a historical process that the book accounts for, showing dynamics in constant tension, living diverse yet connected scenarios in non-linear times. In the books, ideas are alive, and the stories inside it defeat fatalism, showing us that history could have written alternative paths, reviving the question of what would have happened if other stories had taken place, which I firmly believe is a tremendous contribution of the book, allowing us to activate our dormant imagination, putting it to work again in terms of new possible worlds, perhaps without giving up the debate on the morality lost after the legality gained. That leads directly to my next point, where the book puts the law in dialogue with its forgotten and negotiated ethical dimension from Tolstoy reflection. The pages raise a fascinating question about what we lost when we start to question the means we use for war without question war itself. What did we lose along the way in our attempt to make war a succession of atrocious events in which we can also find human acts? This question is vital within law universities, in our legal community, and in the world we are living, so willing to negotiate with human lives. At some point, as you said in the book, we forget our search for freedom and we settle with diminishing the pain. Tolstoy is a captivating character. I would like to ask if he inspired Humane. I wonder if the encounter with this writer and his tormented ideas inspired the rescue of his work, putting him in conversation with our humanized present still at war. Or maybe if the research began to be developed and then serendipity or the luck that accompanies the historian in the archive made a dialogue with Tolstoy possible. Which came first? Tolstoy, Humane, which came first? I find it beautiful how the book weaves the thought of this author in conversation with the present, making audible a distant warning. Humanitarianism could entrench war. When we discuss how perfect lethality can be, the ideal target, the deserving victimizer, we lose humanity, moving dangerously close to an endless war. Why we end soon a war that can be humanized? The parallel with the discussion on slavery was painful, but at the same time revealing. The book succeeds in making us imagine a Tolstoy who seems not to have died in 1918, revisiting his conjectures in times of drums and fires, missiles from the airs, and the highest technology in the service of contemporary warfare. Lastly, I want to highlight how the book questions us as protagonists of this historical contemporaneity that reproduces the dynamics of war through law, believing them to be covered by the veil of coherence, neutrality, and universality. From this perspective, Humane invites us to question the role of the legal profession, of human rights organizations, of governments, even the apparently progressive ones, in the maintenance of this sort of contemporary slavery, using law as a tool to unmask brutality. When I was a law student, international humanitarian law was presented as a great conquest. And we have to repeat that jus ad bellum had arrived to humanize war. As a student, we received it as a contradiction, perhaps with some of Tolstoy's astonishment. But in the end, one had to repeat the mantra, and learn about the Geneva Conventions and the role of Red Cross if one wants to pass the course and become a lawyer. The book reminds me of that moment, and I think this story challenges the myth of the gradual civilizing conquest of law. It shows us that there are not only zones of loneliness where we see brutality like Guantanamo, for example, but also zones of law where we can see it at work. This story showed us states making selective use of norms and choosing their interpretations by exercising violence within the law itself. This directly challenges us because beyond the use of international humanitarian law, there is a question about our use of the law in different legal regimes, including constitutional or administrative law to regulate violence. I was reading the book and thinking about Colombia, because today our bombings obey the rules of operational manuals, and we even talk about the existence of operational law, registering casualties of children in the context of a violent daily life to which we have become accustomed and which we have regulated through the force of law. From this point of view, the book proposes many conversations like this one. Are we living an endless war by making it more acceptable? I suppose your agenda, Professor Moyn, has been a permanent invitation to question utopias. When we allow ourselves to come down from the heaven of legal concepts and moral projects, we stop believing in historical legacies, and we can find some alternative reasons and possibilities behind our inventions, committing ourselves to a less edifying and moralizing, but certainly more humane history. Thank you so much, Professor Moyn. I really enjoyed your book and I learned a lot. And of course, I have some follow-up questions, but first I'm going to give the place to my colleague, Roberto Vidal. Please.
Well, thank you, Tania. Very impressive, your analysis. And thank you, Professor Moyn. And I remember, first of all, a few years ago when our colleague Jorge Gonzalez introduced at the law school your critical work on human rights when he came back of his doctoral studies. And the book suggests a lot of things, as Tania said, for us in Colombia. I want to refer to 2 or 3 of them. We have lived in a protracted conflict that started with the Cold War as an anti-communist fight that applied the lessons learned by Colombian officials at the Korean War in South Asia, and then translated them to the Andean Mountains in 1964 and the fight against FARC. In different processes from the 1970s, Colombia also was the scenario of the international war and prosecution of the production and trafficking of drugs, consumed in a massive way at America and Europe. Both conflicts included the support of the states to the Colombian government. But it was from 1998 when the 2 wars were connected through the Plan Marshall for Colombia. This plan authorized the use of American resources of the war against drugs trafficking in the wake of the war against leftist armed opposition groups to the Colombian government. The open support of the United States transformed the conflict from a land military operation of the Colombian army in a national internationalized war conducted with high technology, intelligent planes, and gunship helicopters. In a few years, the main guerrilla leaders of the FARC were killed in a mainly clean operations that combined intelligence, technology, special troops, and massive bombing. The same happened to the main narco leaders that were extradited to the States. The spectacular and humane war in Colombia captivated the imagination of the nation. In 2016, when the government moved to a strategy of peace negotiation, looking for ending the conflict, a scarce majority of 50.3% of the voters decided to say not to the agreements in a plebiscite. The war seemed to be won and the communist enemy defeated. The humane war has made the peace irrelevant. The political party that sustained the permanence of war won the next elections. The Colombian situation is a regrettably perfect example of the moral conflict that the author explores in the book, Professor Moyn. The dangerous idea of preferring a permanent, clean, humane, technological war. For the urban Colombian masses, the war meant a television narrative of armed conflict that happened in a wild regions that nobody knows. However, the first indictments of the Transitional Tribunal created by the peace agreements, called the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, have showed a different truth and the depth of the horror that any war embraces. In both sides of the hostilities, the former guerrilla and the army, the tribunal has found massive perpetration of crimes of war and crimes against humanity. In the strive for efficiency of the international resources of the war, in a highly regulated conflict by humanitarian law and humane conflict, members of the Colombia Army opt for supporting massively paramilitary private armies that operated with their hands free from the humanitarian law of war. Beyond, members of the Colombian Army, under the pressure of body counting and the required outcomes of the hostilities, made massive operations of purchasing young people, homeless, persons with mental illness, minor children, for killing them and presenting around 6,400 persons as fake guerrilla casualties. In the site of the guerrilla, more than 20,000 persons were kidnapped as an intended humane operation looking for economic support to the cause. In Colombia, we have witnessed the horrible risk of a protracted situation of armed conflict where any normal person can commit the most cruel and horrifying conduct. Any crime, any torture, massive killing, sexual violence, forced displacement, missing people can happen. And the war justifies any practice. Normal people as you and me, as my parents or my uncles, committed the worst crime against humanity in the name of a just and humane war. The challenge now is magnificent. The institution of transitional justice, the national system of peace, has proved, in my opinion, the potentiality for introducing new narratives of the war with new legal and moral questions. The public awareness on the serious problems of the war have grown. The necessity of a total peace, as a social movement has called, now appears in the public agenda. The proceedings of the Transitional Tribunal, along with the report of the Truth Commission and the works of the Unit for the Finding of Missing People, have impacted the public opinion and the political debate. New social and political movements emerge on the basis of non-armed conflict activism. Even the fight against illicit drugs have started to change. Finally, I want to say that it is a moment of hope on the endless pursuit of peace. But in the context that you describe in your book, we need to ask what kind of peace we are pursuing and what kind of transitions we are looking for. Well, thank you.
Thank you very much, Roberto. And I think we now open the floor for a discussion for Professor Moyn to reply to the comments by Tania and Roberto. And if you want to engage each other with the discussion, will be great.
Well, I said it was a privilege before, but now I've just been enthralled by these two sets of commentary, which go far beyond in their elegance and in their richness. The comments I've gotten on the book so far, and so I just say to Tania just how extraordinary an intervention she made, and I'm very grateful for it. I will say that I knew at the beginning of writing the book that Tolstoy would figure in it, because I had seen many years ago the speech that his character in War and Peace, Prince Andrei, gives, and I just was provoked by it, and it led me to research Tolstoy's views across his whole career more thoroughly. And while I certainly was struck by what he does throughout his career, I wanted to be selective. It's true, for example, that partially against my will, and reading his texts and other contemporary texts, I decided to stop eating meat in the course of this research, which is very bad if I come back to Bogota, since I had such wonderful meat there. But I couldn't go all the way with Tolstoy. So, and I thought for American debate, since belligerency has been such a default in it, I would almost marginalize myself if I went all the way. So I tried to isolate an argument that I hoped my fellow citizens would take more seriously. Not that war itself is wrong, but that there are these risks. And as you say, those are disquieting enough possibilities that I think they ought to be taken seriously. Roberto, I appreciate your insightful stress on the kind of parallels, and go far beyond my knowledge of the Colombian situation, and look, if having tried to write an American history, the same worries that I revive from the past, and the same kind of priority of peace, at least as a default, that I try to revive from the past, are relevant elsewhere, then I'm thrilled, and I hope that that there could be someday a kind of very international return to the priority of peace in an age of endless and humane wars, wherever they may take place unjustly. The really hard question, I think, for all of us is whether we go with Tolstoy all the way. I assume not, that we think that there might be occasions for just and necessary war. And in that case, of course, Tolstoy's arguments don't apply, because humanizing them doesn't have the risks that he pointed out. But since there are so many unjust wars, I think it's very good for us to think collectively about how we, think more critically about the law. And there, I think Tania's closing insights are absolutely right. I mean, I've always been of the view that the law is not good. It just depends. And it has all kinds of effects. And, you know, it depends who controls the law and what uses it's put to. And I think you really brilliantly kind of isolated that bigger terrain for thinking and struggle and in the future for a more just set of outcomes. So I'll, you know, just thank you both from the bottom of my heart, and would love to hear any other comments or questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Moyn and Tania and Justice Roberto. It has been amazing to listen to you have this conversation. Of course, we would like for it to continue longer. Santiago and I just have one more question before we close. And we would like to ask if you could tell us what has been the role of the war on war, and what approach should we do to those wars, to those laws? And also, if you would like to delve into the role of the international organizations, which we know you have a point on that, because they have engaged in and stopped criticizing the existence of the war and rather the quality of the war, if we can so call it.
Thank you so much. So it's true that, you know, following my presentation of Tolstoy, I wanted to look at people who wanted to design the piece in an age when there was still, you know, kind of state rights to kind of to commence and continue wars. And I really appreciate also Tania's mention of the fact that it wasn't just a particular woman whom I spotlight, named Berta von Suttner, but women in general who mobilize most prominently, at least across the Atlantic, to press for a peace agenda. But I wanted to show that the success of that peace agenda, in a sense, came at a price, because it was an agenda that focused on the transatlantic and led to American hegemony. And with the Cold War, that had grievous consequences, as Roberto said, in Latin America, and the form that opposition to insurgency took in the transnational organization of the response to that insurgency. I don't talk about that in my work, but I definitely talk about other forms of Cold War brutality under American auspices, including in direct intervention in, you know, places like Korea and Vietnam. So I wanna kind of recall the kind of insight of our ancestors, that if you organize a peace, you have automatically kept war crimes from happening, but the reverse isn't true. And that, of course, means we need credible institutions. I do think it's very significant in the history of international law and institutions that the United Nations began as a peace mechanism. And the Nuremberg trials were first and foremost about stigmatizing aggression, not atrocity. And that our emphases have shifted over time. And I think we should press for the reversal of those emphases so that peace has a better chance, and we take more seriously kind of saving the world from American hegemony. Of course, it could be worse, but we could imagine a return to that international peace project that actually made the situation better. We haven't fundamentally confronted internationally institutions for, you know, deterring internal armed conflict of the kind that you've had, and yet this, for any cosmopolitan, is something of concern to everyone everywhere. with all its costs. So, you know, we've learned since 1989 in general that we're not at the end of history as we were told, but in a way at the beginning of it, with the kind of aspiration of peace rather than humane war, which we shouldn't tolerate, as at least if it's endless and unjust, and a task before us as lawyers, because we know, as Tania said, the law serves whomever controls it, and that means we should try to control it for the sake of new international institutions and a return to peace within them, at least insofar as that's the most just outcome.
Thank you, Professor Moyn. Just to finish, I had also a general question, and it's regarding the value of law in general, and especially related to a really controversial chapter in your book, that it was the discussion around the role of Michael Ratner's. And especially because these also can go back to Colombia, where we have a lot of leaders who are fighting in courts, bringing allegations before courts, and seeing some kind of internal value of the law itself. They see that even if law doesn't have the transformative value that we usually think it has, at least it can achieve some minor changes. I think that was in part implied in the reply that some activists gave to you to the chapter of Michael Ratner. So my question was whether, if following the line that you set out in Humane, we are left with no hope at all in the law, that we see it just like as a kind of a rule of law in the Brashian terms, very thin, that there's nothing in there, it's just an instrument, or if we could see law as something having more value attached to it, and that leaders and litigators should use law to gain at least some small wins.
No, thank you so much for that important question. So again, law is neither good or bad. It depends on what it does and who controls it, and it's bad in general insofar as like unjust social relations have prevailed in human history, although we can argue that law has helped in changing that, you know, but it's also mainly sustained those relations. And, you know, there's a battle not to get rid of law, but to kind of make it less an agent of domination and more an agent of, you know, liberation and equalization of citizens and human beings. And again, we're only at the beginning of that. Now, there's a separate question about what are the ethical stakes of operating within extant legal systems, and let's say asking judges to either enforce the good parts of extant law or change the law through interpreting it when there's not another possibility. And I think that, you know, my general case is that that's a good mechanism of change if there's not a better one, but that even it can have these risks that I you know, tried to highlight in Tolstoy's tracts, that if you get a judge to make your war more humane, you may participate in its entrenchment. And that may be the best outcome given the available choices, but it's an outcome. And so if Tolstoy's argument is that we have to attend to the risks of our acts, that has to apply to litigators and judges too. Because when you create good, minimal or massive good, you also create collateral consequences with which we all have to live. And that happened, I believe, in the purgation of the war on terror in its first form from its brutality, which opened up for Obama the possibility of legitimating its new form. On the slide I showed you, he said, "I'm not Bush." well, that's a claim he could make, because the war that Bush fought in its brutal form had been made illegitimate, suggesting that a more humane form of war could take its place. And that's what happened.
Thank you very much, Professor Moyn. Thank you to Roberto, to Tania, to Nicolás, Carolina, to Maria Carolina and Andres for helping us from Universidad Javeriana to this event together. And I think we're very thankful for having Professor Moyn